What defines a professional's competence? Knowledge, experience, or appearance? At St. Clair Hospital, the answer seemed obvious, until the day a single phrase made everything crumble. Helen was about to discover that change begins when someone decides to say enough. Helen adjusted her badge on her impeccably clean uniform as she walked through the halls of St. Clair Hospital, one of the most prestigious in Chicago. Her steps were firm, as they had been for the past 15 years of dedication to the institution. The clock read 7:15 a.m., and she had already double-checked the medication for all the patients in the cardiology ward. At 42, Helen carried not only the extra weight that bothered her so much, but also a wealth of knowledge that made her one of the most respected nurses by the staff. Or almost all the staff. As she organized the tray with medications for her first patient of the day, she felt that familiar gaze burning the back of her neck. Dr. Richard Mason, head of the cardiac surgery team, stood at the door of the nursing station. Tall, athletic, and with a face that had graced medical magazines, he embodied everything society expected from a successful surgeon. His skill with the scalpel was unquestionable, but his personality left much to be desired. "Nurse," his voice cut through the air like a razor, "I hope you've triple-checked Mr. Frank Anderson's medication. We can't afford mistakes with a patient of his caliber." Helen took a deep breath before responding, maintaining the professionalism that had always characterized her. "As always, doctor, all procedures have been verified according to protocol." "Good," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I must admit, it worries me to see someone who clearly doesn't care about their own health taking care of my patients." The comment hit Helen like a slap, but she didn't show it. Years of experience with Dr. Richard's temperament had taught her to build an emotional wall. The younger nurses watched the scene in silence, some lowering their gaze, others exchanging looks of contained indignation. What no one expected was the voice that came from the door of room 507. "Interesting point, doctor. Could you elaborate on that thought?" Frank Anderson, the patient occupying the room, was standing, leaning against the doorframe. At 55, he didn't look like the real estate mogul he was. Dressed in the traditional hospital gown and without his usual Italian suits, he could pass for any other patient. Dr. Richard adjusted his posture, clearly uncomfortable with the interruption. "Mr. Anderson, you should be resting. Your surgery..." "My surgery is scheduled for tomorrow, doctor, and I feel perfectly capable of having this conversation now," Frank interrupted with a calmness that only the very powerful possess. "In fact, I'm quite interested in understanding how someone's physical appearance determines their professional competence." The hallway, usually bustling at that time of the morning, plunged into a dense silence. Helen continued her work, methodically organizing the medications, but her ears were attuned to every word. "Mr. Anderson," Dr. Richard tried to regain control of the situation, "surely you understand that in medicine, more than in any other field, we need to be examples of health and discipline." Frank took a few steps forward, his presence filling the hallway in a way his hospital gown couldn't diminish. "You know, doctor, in the last 3 days I've been here, I've observed a lot. It's a habit I developed over years building my empire. Observing people, evaluating character, identifying talent." He paused, his eyes scanning each face present before continuing. "And what I observed was a nurse who always arrives 15 minutes before her shift, who knows the name of every patient, who never, not once, showed impatience or neglect. A professional whom other team members seek out when they have questions, whom patients trust, and who, even in the face of derogatory comments, maintains her dignity and professionalism." Dr. Richard paled slightly, but Frank wasn't finished. "I also observed a brilliant surgeon, technically impeccable, who unfortunately confuses authority with authoritarianism and appearance with competence. And you know what's most interesting, doctor? As a member of the hospital's board of directors, I have access to all patient satisfaction statistics and post-operative complication rates. Nurse Helen has an impeccable record. 0 errors in 15 years. Can you say the same?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times, but no sound came out. Helen continued her work, but anyone paying attention could see a slight tremor in her hands. not from fear or shame, but from contained emotion. Dr. Richard began, but Frank raised his hand, cutting him off. No need to answer now, Doctor. In fact, I suggest you use this moment for reflection, and maybe, just maybe, consider that true competence in healthcare isn't measured by appearances, but by dedication, humanity, and results. Frank's words echoed through the hallway, carrying a weight no scalpel could cut. Dr. Richard, for the first time in years, seemed to shrink a few inches. Without saying another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the vinyl floor. Helen finally allowed her shoulders to relax slightly. When she looked up, she met Frank's gaze, who offered her a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just keep doing your excellent work. And as for Dr. Richard," Frank paused significantly, "I believe he'll have plenty of time to reflect on his values during the board meeting next week." The rest of the day passed with a different energy in the cardiology ward. People whispered about what had happened, and more than one nurse passed by Helen with a knowing smile. But for her, nothing had changed. She continued her routine with the same dedication as always, because she knew her true strength had never been in the approval of others, but in the certainty of her own worth. What no one knew yet was that day would mark the beginning of a great transformation at St. Clair Hospital, a change that would affect not only Dr. Richard and Helen, but the entire institution. Because sometimes all it takes is one courageous voice to start a quiet revolution, and Frank Anderson was determined to be that voice. The next morning, St. Clair Hospital seemed to vibrate with a different energy. The news of the confrontation between Frank Anderson and Dr. Richard had spread through the halls like an electric current, electrifying whispered conversations in corners and meaningful glances between staff members. Helen arrived at the hospital at the same time as always, 7:15 a.m., her punctuality unshakable like an anchor amidst the growing commotion. As she walked toward the cardiology ward, she noticed the different looks she received, some of admiration, others of curiosity, but all carrying a new kind of respect. In the locker room, she found Marina, a young nurse who had recently been hired and had always shown admiration for her work. "Helen, you won't believe this," Marina whispered, approaching as she adjusted her uniform. "Dr. Richard cancelled all his surgeries today." The news took Helen by surprise. In 15 years, she had never witnessed Dr. Richard cancel a surgery, much less an entire schedule. "And the patients?" she asked, her professional instinct immediately concerned for those awaiting the procedures. "Dr. Andrew took over the most urgent cases," Marina explained, referring to the second most experienced surgeon on the team. The others were rescheduled for next week. Helen nodded, absorbing the information as she organized her belongings in the locker. Her first thought was for Frank Anderson, who was supposed to be operated on that morning. "And Mr. Anderson." "That's the most interesting part," Marina lowered her voice even more, leaning in. "He specifically requested that Dr. Andrew perform his surgery. It seems he no longer trusts Dr. Richard." The news didn't completely surprise Helen. Frank Anderson didn't seem like the type of man who would let Dr. Richard's behavior slide. However, there was something about the whole situation that bothered her. Despite everything, she knew the surgeon's work. His arrogance was proportional to his competence, and many patients owed their lives to his skilled hands. As she began her morning rounds, Helen was surprised by a message on the hospital's internal system. An extraordinary meeting had been called for that afternoon, with mandatory attendance. For the entire cardiology team, the sender was none other than Dr. Beatrice Fields, the hospital's general director. The morning passed at a different pace than usual. Dr. Richard's absence was like a vacuum in the air, creating an environment that was simultaneously lighter and more tense. Helen maintained her meticulous routine, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her colleagues' behavior. Some doctors, who before barely greeted her, now made a point of exchanging a few words. The younger nurses sought her out, more frequently, asking questions they would have hesitated to ask before. Around 11 a.m., Helen was checking Frank Anderson's vital signs when he woke up from post-operative sedation. His eyes, still a bit foggy, focused on her with the same intensity as the day before. "How are you feeling, Mr. Anderson?" she asked, maintaining her usual professionalism. "Like someone who just had their chest opened," he replied with a slight smile, his voice still hoarse. "But in the best hands possible." Helen continued her procedures in silence, but Frank wasn't finished. "You know, Nurse Helen, yesterday wasn't the first time I witnessed something like this in this hospital." She paused for a moment, her hands suspended in the air as she adjusted the IV. Frank continued. "In the last few months, I've been receiving concerning reports about the work environment here. Moral harassment, discrimination, abuse of authority. Yesterday's incident was just the tip of the iceberg." "Mr. Anderson," Helen began, choosing her words carefully, "I appreciate your intervention yesterday, but I don't want to be the cause of problems." "Problems?" Frank let out a soft laugh, which quickly turned into a small grimace of pain. "My dear, you're not the problem. You're part of the solution this hospital desperately needs." Before Helen could respond, the door to the room opened, revealing Dr. Beatrice Fields. The hospital director was a woman in her 50s, known for her firm and fair demeanor. Her dark eyes scanned the room, assessing the situation. "Mr. Anderson, it's good to see you awake," she said, approaching the bed. "Helen, could you give us a moment?" Helen nodded, finishing her notes on the chart. As she headed to the door, she heard Frank's voice. "Dr. Fields, why don't you ask Helen to stay? After all, what we're going to discuss concerns her directly." The director hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed with a nod. Helen closed the door and remained standing near the window as Dr. Fields sat in the chair next to the bed. "Mr. Anderson, I received your letter this morning," the director began. "Santi, I must admit I was disturbed by your account." "I imagine so," Frank replied, adjusting slightly in bed. "But I believe it's time for us to make significant changes in this institution, and for that, we need people like Nurse Helen in leadership positions." Helen felt her heart race. What exactly were they talking about? "The program you proposed is quite bold," Dr. Fields commented, her eyes briefly meeting Helen's. "Creating an ethics and conduct committee led by employees from different hierarchical levels. This will generate resistance." "Resistance already exists, Doctor," Frank argued. "The difference is that now we're bringing it to light so we can properly address it. And as for Dr. Richard, he requested a temporary leave this morning," Dr. Fields interrupted. "He said he needs time to re-evaluate his priorities." A significant silence filled the room. Helen remained still, her brain processing all the implications of that conversation. It was clear that big changes were coming, and somehow she was at the center of them. "Helen," Frank called her attention, "would you like to chair the new Ethics and Conduct Committee at St. Clair Hospital?" The question caught Helen completely off guard. For a moment, she felt the weight of 15 years of experience, of all the times she had swallowed hurtful comments, of every moment she had to prove her worth twice as much as others. But she also felt the weight of responsibility, the possibility of making a real difference in the lives of others who had gone through what she had. She began, but was interrupted by a sudden commotion in the hallway. Raised voices were approaching the room, and one of them was unmistakable. Dr. Richard had returned to the hospital. What would happen next would change not only Helen's life, but the very DNA of St. Clair Hospital forever. Because sometimes, the greatest transformations begin in the most unexpected moments and with the most unlikely people. The voices in the hallway approached like an announced storm. Helen instinctively positioned herself between the door and Frank Anderson's bed, her nurse's protective instinct overriding any personal apprehension. Dr. Fields stood up, assuming a posture that blended authority and caution. The door opened, with a brusque movement, revealing Dr. Richard. His normally controlled face was red, and his always impeccable lab coat showed signs of wrinkling. Behind him, 2 hospital security guards and the nursing supervisor, Sandra, tried to intercept. Doctor, you can't," Sandra began, but was interrupted. I can't enter my own ward, where I've operated for 15 years." Dr. Richard's voice was charged with an emotion no one there had witnessed before. "I just came to clarify a few things. Richard, Dr. Fields intervened, her voice as firm as steel. "You requested leave this morning. You shouldn't be here." "I requested leave under pressure," he retorted, his eyes scanning the room until they fixed on Frank. "After discovering that a certain board member was digging into my reputation." Frank remained serene in his bed, merely raising an eyebrow slightly. "Investigating reports of moral harassment and unethical behavior can hardly be called digging." "Doctor." "Reports," Dr. Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Based on what? On the fact that I demand excellence? That I don't accept mediocrity in my ward?" "No," Helen surprised herself by cutting through the tense air of the room. "Based on the fact that you confuse authority with authoritarianism, competence with appearance, and respect with fear." The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes turned to Helen, who continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "For 15 years, Doctor, I've observed. I've seen excellent employees request transfers because they couldn't stand your abuse. I've seen nurses cry in the locker room after your constructive feedback. I've seen brilliant resident doctors give up on cardiology because you turned learning into psychological torture." Dr. Richard took a step toward her, but the security guards immediately closed in. Dr. Fields raised her hand, signaling for everyone to remain calm. "You have no idea the pressure of being the best," Dr. Richard said, his voice now more controlled but still trembling with contained anger. "The responsibility of having lives depending on your decisions, on your hands." "No," Helen interrupted him again, "you have no idea what it truly means to be the best, because the best healthcare professional isn't just someone who saves lives, but someone who also preserves the dignity of those who work beside them." Frank adjusted himself in his bed, a slight smile of approval on his lips. "You know, Dr. Richard, that's exactly why I chose Helen to lead the hospital's new Ethics and Conduct Committee." "What?" Dr. Richard turned to Dr. Fields. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No, Richard," the director replied firmly. "It's a necessary change, one that should have happened a long time ago." "You can't do this," he argued, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair, now beginning to come undone. "I built this ward's reputation. I made St. Clair a reference in cardiac surgery." "Yes," Frank intervened, "and no one is denying your technical competence. But a hospital isn't made just of technique, Doctor. It's made of humanity." At that moment, Sandra, the nursing supervisor, stepped forward. "Dr. Richard, I have here a folder with over 30 employee reports, documented cases from the last 5 years, moral harassment, discrimination, abuse of authority." "And you kept this for 5 years?" he asked, incredulous. "We kept it out of fear," Sandra replied simply, "the same fear you confused with respect all this time." Dr. Richard staggered slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. For the first time, his face showed something other than anger. It showed understanding. "The board will meet next week," Dr. Fields informed, her voice now softer. "Until then, you are officially on leave. Use this time to reflect, Richard. You're a brilliant surgeon, but you need to decide what kind of human being you want to be." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't tense or threatening, but charged with possibilities. Dr. Richard looked at each person in the room, lingering a bit longer on Helen. For a moment, she saw something in his eyes, vulnerability perhaps, before he turned and left the room without another word. The security guards followed him, and Sandra left soon after, leaving only Helen, Frank, and Dr. Fields in the room. "Well," Frank broke the silence, "I guess it's official now. Helen, you still haven't answered my question about chairing the committee." Helen looked at her hands, those hands that for so many years had cared for patients, organized medications, and occasionally wiped hidden tears. Hands that could now help shape a fairer and more humane work environment. "Yes," she replied, looking up. "I accept." Dr. Fields smiled, the first genuine smile since she had entered the room. "Great, because we have a lot of work ahead. St. Clair Hospital is going to change, Helen, and you will be a fundamental part of that change." "Actually," Frank added, "you already are. Sometimes all a toxic environment needs is someone brave, enough to say enough, someone who inspires others to stand up too." Helen felt the weight of responsibility, but also the lightness of possibility. The coming weeks would be challenging, she knew. There would be resistance, obstacles, those who would try to maintain the status quo. But for the first time in 15 years, there was also hope. Hope for a hospital where a professional's value wouldn't be measured by their appearance, but by their character and competence. As she organized the final details of that historic shift, Helen couldn't help but think of all the other Helens who existed in the hospital, dedicated professionals who suffered in silence, who hid their worth under layers of insecurity imposed by years of prejudice. Now she would have the chance to be their voice, to turn fear into courage, silence into dialogue, discrimination into respect. St. Clair Hospital would never be the same, and that, Helen realized with a smile, was exactly what it needed. A week had passed since the confrontation in Frank Anderson's room. Helen was in her new office, a modest but significant space located on the 3rd floor of St. Clair Hospital. On the E door, a newly installed plaque read, Ethics and Conduct Committee, Helen Sanders, Chairperson. As she organized a stack of documents on her desk, Helen still wondered if all of this was real. The past few weeks had felt like a whirlwind of events that had turned her life upside down. Yet, there she was, about to lead her first official meeting as chairperson of the committee. "Excuse me," a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. At the door stood Dr. Carla Miller, one of the hospital's youngest residents, with a hesitant expression. "May I come in?" Helen gestured for her to sit. Carla was a promising physician, with only 2 years of residency under her belt, but already demonstrating exceptional talent in pediatric cardiology. However, something about her posture betrayed her nervousness. "How can I help you, Dr. Carla?" Helen asked, noticing how the young doctor twisted her hands in her lap. "It's about Dr. Paul," Carla began, referring to another senior cardiac surgeon at the hospital. "Since Dr. Richard stepped aside, he's taken over as the temporary head of the department and, well, things haven't changed much." Helen felt her stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation she had feared. The toxic culture of the hospital ran deeper than just one authoritarian doctor. "How so?" Helen encouraged, picking up a notepad. Carla hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "He's been making comments about my weight during surgeries. He says that overweight doctors don't inspire confidence in patients, that I should consider bariatric surgery if I want to continue in the specialty." Helen felt a painful déjà vu. It was like reliving her own story, but now she had the power to do something about it. "Have you documented these incidents?" "Yes," Carla replied, pulling a small notebook from her bag. "I've noted dates, times, and witnesses as instructed in the new complaint protocol." Helen smiled inwardly. The protocol had been one of her first initiatives as chairperson, and seeing it already in use was gratifying. "Dr. Carla, first I want you to know that it was very brave of you to come here," Helen began, her voice conveying the confidence she had cultivated over the years. "And I assure you that your complaint will be handled with the utmost confidentiality and seriousness." At that moment, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sandra, the nursing supervisor, entered with a concerned expression. "Helen, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation in the operating room," she said, casting a meaningful glance at Carla. "Dr. Paul is refusing to operate with Nurse Julia because, according to him, she doesn't fit the profile of the team." Helen felt her blood boil. Julia was one of the most competent nurses in the OR, with over a decade of experience. Her only problem, she didn't fit the aesthetic standards some doctors deemed appropriate. "Dr. Carla, can we continue this conversation later?" Helen asked, already standing. The young doctor nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes as she saw Helen's determination. On the way to the operating room, Helen was accompanied by Sandra and Dr. Andrew, who had become an important ally in recent weeks. The surgeon, who had always remained neutral in the hospital's political issues, now seemed to have found his voice. "This can't go on," Dr. Andrew commented as they walked. "We're losing excellent professionals because of this kind of behavior." When they reached the OR, They found a tense scene. Dr. Paul, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, was gesturing emphatically while Julia stood silent, her rigid posture revealing the effort to maintain her composure. "Dr. Paul," Helen called, her voice clear and firm, echoing in the space. "Can we talk for a moment?" The doctor turned, a condescending smile on his lips. "Helen, with all due respect, this is a technical matter. I need a team that's competent," Helen interrupted, maintaining a professional tone. "Because if that's the criterion, Julia has the best performance records in the OR for the past 5 years." Dr. Andrew stepped forward, positioning himself beside Helen. "Paul, you know very well there's no technical basis for your refusal, and as the temporary head of the department, your decisions need to be based on objective criteria. Moreover," Sandra added, "the hospital's new regulations are very clear about discrimination based on appearance. You received a copy last week, didn't you?" Dr. Paul looked around, suddenly realizing he was surrounded not just by people, but by a new institutional reality. His power was no longer absolute, his decisions no longer unquestionable. "I suggest we rethink this situation," Helen proposed, her voice now softer. "Dr. Paul, you're an excellent surgeon. Your experience and knowledge are valuable to the hospital, but we need to evolve as an institution. The world is changing and St. Clair can't be left behind." There was a moment of tense silence, where the future of the hospital seemed to hang in the balance. Then, something unexpected happened. Dr. Paul lowered his shoulders, an almost imperceptible gesture of surrender. "Perhaps," he began, choosing his words carefully, "perhaps I was hasty. Julia, shall we proceed with the surgery?" The nurse nodded professionally, showing no emotion, but her eyes, when they met Helen's, were filled with gratitude. As the team prepared for the surgery, Helen watched the activity with a mix of relief and determination. Each small victory was a step toward the change the hospital so desperately needed, but she knew the road would be long. Back in her office, Helen found 3 more complaints on her desk. Similar cases, different departments. The toxic culture had deep roots at St. Clair, and uprooting them would require more than just good intentions. "One step at a time," she murmured to herself, picking up the first report. The hospital wouldn't change overnight, but every small advance was significant. Every voice that rose against prejudice, every professional who found the courage to speak up, every person who began to question behaviors once considered normal, all of it was part of a greater transformation. And Helen was determined to see that transformation through, no matter how long it took. The main auditorium of St. Clair Hospital was packed that Thursday morning. Helen watched from the front row as professionals from all departments settled into their seats. It was the first official seminar on moral harassment and discrimination in the hospital environment, an initiative of the new Ethics and Conduct Committee. Dr. Fields took the stage, adjusting the microphone as the last people found their places. Beside her, a projected presentation displayed the hospital's new slogan, "Excellence with Humanity." "Good morning, everyone," the director began, her voice echoing through the room. "We're here today to discuss not just changes in our protocols, but a fundamental transformation in our institutional culture." Helen scanned the auditorium, noticing familiar faces. Dr. Carla was seated a few rows back alongside other residents. Dr. Paul, surprisingly, had chosen a seat in the front, his expression serious but attentive. And in the last row, almost unnoticed, was Dr. Richard. His presence caused a small stir in Helen. He hadn't been seen at the hospital since the incident in Frank Anderson's room 3 weeks prior. Now dressed in civilian clothes instead of the traditional lab coat, he seemed somehow smaller, more human. "In the past 30 days, Dr. Fields continued, we've received 43 complaints of inappropriate behavior, 43 situations where colleagues felt diminished, disrespected, or discriminated against. This isn't just a number. It's 43 stories of pain and silence that needed to be heard." A murmur spread through the auditorium. Helen knew many that had contributed to that number, finally finding the courage to speak up. "But today we're not here to point fingers or assign blame," the director went on. "We're here to learn, to grow as an institution, and for that, I'd Like to call up our Ethics and Conduct Committee chairperson, Helen Sanders." Helen stood, feeling the weight of all eyes on her. As she walked to the stage, she remembered her first week at the hospital 15 years ago, when she could barely lift her eyes during team meetings. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her initial nervousness. "When I took on this role, many questioned whether a nurse, especially one who didn't fit traditional aesthetic standards, could lead such a significant transformation. Some suggested I might not have the proper qualifications, or that my appearance wouldn't inspire the necessary respect." She paused, noticing how some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But that's exactly why I'm here. Because for 15 years, I lived what it means to be judged not by your competence but by your appearance, and I know I'm not alone." In the audience, several heads nodded silently. St. Clair Hospital has always been recognized for its technical excellence. Our success rates in complex procedures are nationally renowned. But technical excellence without humanity is like a scalpel without the hand that guides it, a tool without purpose. Helen then shared some anonymous stories she had collected over the past weeks. Accounts of professionals humiliated during surgeries, residents who had considered leaving medicine, nurses who had developed anxiety issues due to the toxic environment. "But something is changing," she continued, a soft smile forming on her lips. "In the past week, we've received 15 suggestions for improving our work environment. 3 senior doctors volunteered to participate in workshops on nonviolent communication, and most importantly, people are starting to speak up, to take a stand." It was then that something unexpected happened. Dr. Richard raised his hand, asking to speak. Helen felt her heart race but nodded. He began, his voice choked. "I'd like to say something, if I may." Helen gestured for him to approach the stage. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath as the surgeon walked down the central aisle. "For 20 years, he said, now facing the audience, "I believed I was doing what was best for the hospital. That demanding perfection, that maintaining rigid standards was the only way to ensure excellence. But in the past few weeks, I've had a lot of time to reflect." He turned to Helen, his eyes revealing a vulnerability no one there had ever witnessed. "I was wrong," he said simply. "And I apologize, not just to Helen but to everyone I hurt with my behavior. I learned the hard way that true excellence doesn't come from fear, but from respect." The silence that followed was profound, almost palpable. Helen felt tears forming in her eyes but held them back. This wasn't a moment for personal emotions. It was a moment of institutional transformation. "Thank you, Dr. Richard," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Your acknowledgement is an important example of what we're trying to build here, an environment where we can admit mistakes, learn from them, and grow together." The rest of the seminar unfolded with a different energy. People who normally remained silent began to participate, sharing experiences and suggestions. Hierarchical barriers seemed momentarily dissolved, replaced by a common sense of purpose. By the end of the afternoon, as Helen organized her notes, she was surprised by a knock at her door. It was Marina, the young nurse. "Helen," she said, a radiant smile on her face, "you won't believe what happened at lunch today. For the first time in 2 years, all the residents sat with the nursing staff. And guess what? Dr. Paul suggested we make it a regular thing to improve communication between teams." Helen smiled, feeling a wave of hope. Small changes, perhaps, but significant, like raindrops that, one by one, have the power to transform an entire landscape. St. Clair Hospital was changing, not just in its policies and procedures, but in its essence. And that change, Helen realized, was like a wave that once started could no longer be contained. A month after the historic seminar, Helen was poring over a stack of reports in her office when she noticed something intriguing. While explicit, complaints of harassment and discrimination had significantly decreased. A new pattern was emerging, something more subtle, harder to identify and combat. "Passive resistance," she murmured to herself, circling keywords in different documents. Professionals who had once been openly hostile were now adopting more covert tactics. Exclusion from important meetings, deliberate delays in responding to urgent requests, small comments that seemed innocent but carried derogatory meanings. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Carla, accompanied by Dr. Andrew. "Helen, we have a delicate situation," Dr. Andrew began, closing the door behind him. "It's about the selection process for the cardiology department head." Helen straightened in her chair. With Dr. Richard's definitive departure, the position had been vacant for weeks, temporarily filled by Dr. Paul. "What happened?" "We discovered that some members of the selection committee are maneuvering behind the scenes," Carla explained, her voice tense. "They've created specific criteria that coincidentally eliminate all female candidates and professionals who don't fit a certain profile." "What kind of criteria?" Helen asked, already grabbing her notepad. "For example," Dr. Andrew interjected, "requiring publications in specific journals in the past 2 years, participation in-person international conferences, availability for extra shifts without prior notice. Criteria that disproportionately affect professionals who are mothers or primary caregivers," Helen completed, understanding the strategy. "Institutional discrimination disguised as meritocracy." At that moment, Sandra entered the room, carrying more documents. "Helen, you need to see this. I've received reports that some patients are being subtly steered to avoid care from professionals who don't fit the hospital's traditional profile." Helen felt her stomach churn. It was as if prejudice, prevented from manifesting openly, had found new, more insidious paths. "We need a new approach," she said, standing and walking to the whiteboard on her wall. "The problem is no longer just behavioral, it's structural." She began writing, listing points as she spoke. "First, we need to review all the hospital's selection processes, not just for leadership positions, but for all roles. Second, we'll create a reverse mentorship program." "Reverse mentorship?" Carla asked, intrigued. "Yes," Helen smiled. "Junior professionals or those from traditionally marginalized groups mentoring senior managers, sharing perspectives, experiences, challenges that may never have been considered." Dr. Andrew nodded, understanding. "Like that time you explained to Dr. Paul why some nurses needed to rotate night shifts due to family commitments." "Exactly," Helen confirmed. "Sometimes prejudice doesn't come from malice, but from a lack of understanding of others' realities." At that moment, they were interrupted by movement in the hallway. Dr. Richard was back at the hospital, not as a doctor, but as a consultant for the humanization program. "May I come in?" he asked, his posture different from the arrogance of before. "I think I can contribute to this discussion." Helen hesitated for a moment, but gestured for him to join the group. Dr. Richard had gone through an intense process of reflection and therapy in recent weeks, and his unique perspective as someone who had recognized and worked to change his prejudices could be valuable. "For years," he began, "I perpetuated toxic behaviors without question because that's how things had always been done. But now I realize that it's not enough to stop discriminating. We need to actively create an environment that celebrates diversity." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Sandra asked, her voice still carrying a hint of skepticism. "By recognizing that excellence comes in many forms," he replied. "For example, why don't we create quality indicators that include not just technical outcomes, but also communication skills, empathy, teamwork?" Helen smiled, pleasantly surprised. "That would completely change the dynamics of evaluation and promotion in the hospital." "And more," Carla added, excited. "We could create diverse working groups to redesign processes and protocols, ensuring different perspectives are considered from the start." The discussion continued for hours, with ideas and suggestions flowing from all present. Helen watched, amazed, as this small group represented exactly the kind of change she dreamed of for the hospital. Different people, with different experiences, working together toward a common goal. By the end of the afternoon, as she organized the meeting notes, Helen received a message from Frank Anderson. The businessman, who continued to closely follow the hospital's transformations, had secured board approval for an ambitious project. St. Clair would be the first hospital in the country to implement a comprehensive equity and inclusion program. serving as a model for other institutions. Sometimes, Helen thought, the deepest changes start in the most unlikely places. A hospital once known only for its technical excellence was now becoming a reference in humanization and equity. As she packed up to leave, Helen passed by the hospital's mural where a new photo had been placed. The entire OR team, people of different sizes, colors, and ages, all smiling side by side. It wasn't a perfect photo by traditional standards, but it was real, authentic, and above all, human. The road ahead was still long, she knew. Prejudices and discrimination had deep roots, and uprooting them would take time, patience, and persistence. But looking at that photo, at those genuine smiles, Helen was certain change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. The auditorium of the Chicago Medical Convention Center was packed. Helen adjusted the microphone on her blouse, trying to control her nerves as she observed the audience composed of directors and managers from the country's top hospitals. Beside her, Dr. Fields smiled encouragingly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the St. Clair director began, "6 months ago, our hospital embarked on a journey many considered risky, even impossible. Today, we're here to share not just results, but a new vision of how a hospital environment can and should function." The presentation that followed showed impressive numbers: a 70% reduction in moral harassment complaints, decreased staff turnover, increased satisfaction rates among both patients and professionals. But it was the stories behind the numbers that truly captured the audience's attention. When I took on the role of Ethics and Conduct Committee chairperson, Helen took the floor, her voice firmer than she ever imagined possible. Many questioned whether a nurse, especially one who didn't fit traditional aesthetic standards, could lead such a significant transformation. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing similar prejudices in themselves. But what we discovered was that true transformation only happens when we give voice and space to different perspectives and experiences. It's not just about combating discrimination, it's about creating an environment where diversity is seen as a strength, not a problem to be tolerated. In the back of the auditorium, Helen spotted familiar faces. Dr. Richard was there, along with Dr. Paul and several other St. Clair professionals who had made a point to support her. Among them, Dr. Carla smiled proudly, her lab coat now bearing the badge of Cardiology Residency Coordinator. "Our reverse mentorship program, for example," Helen continued, "not only helped break hierarchical barriers, but also brought innovative solutions to old problems. When we started truly listening to professionals who had traditionally been silenced, we discovered perspectives we had never considered." The presentation was interrupted by spontaneous applause when Helen shared the story of a nurse who had developed a new protocol for bariatric patient care based on her own experiences with prejudice in the hospital environment. "But perhaps our greatest achievement," Dr. Fields took the floor again, "has been the change in institutional culture. It's no longer acceptable to disguise prejudice as professional concern or mask discrimination as standards of excellence." The audience erupted into applause once more, many nodding in agreement. Dr. Fields continued, her voice steady and filled with pride. "At St. Clair, we've learned that true excellence in healthcare isn't just about technical skill. It's about compassion, respect, and creating an environment where everyone, from the newest intern to the most seasoned surgeon, feels valued and heard." Helen glanced at the crowd, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She caught sight of Dr. Richard, who was clapping along with the rest, his expression one of quiet reflection. It was a far cry from the man who had once ruled the hospital with an iron fist, and Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. As the applause died down, Dr. Fields turned to Helen. "Helen, would you like to share a few final words?" Helen stepped forward, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room filled with some of the most influential figures in the medical field. "Thank you, Dr. Fields, and thank you all for being here today. When I first started at St. Clair, I never imagined I'd be standing here sharing our journey with all of you. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because of a collective effort, because of people who are willing to stand up, speak out, and challenge the status quo. She paused, her gaze settling on Dr. Richard for a moment before moving on. We've come a long way at St. Clair, but we're not done yet. There's still work to be done, not just in our hospital, but across the entire healthcare system. And I believe that together, we can create a future where every patient, every nurse, every doctor, and every staff member feels respected, valued, and empowered to do their best work. The room erupted into applause once more, and Helen stepped back, her heart pounding. As she returned to her seat, Dr. Fields gave her a warm smile and a nod of approval. The rest of the seminar continued with presentations from other hospitals that had begun implementing similar programs, inspired by St. Clair's success. Helen listened intently, taking notes and exchanging ideas with her peers. After the event, as the crowd began to disperse, Helen was approached by several attendees who wanted to learn more about St. Clair's initiatives. Among them was Dr. Marcia Oliveira, the director of one of the largest hospitals in New York City. "Helen," Dr. Oliveira began, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and regret. 15 years ago, I was part of a panel that rejected your transfer to our hospital. At the time, I used technical arguments, but the truth is, I had the same prejudices you're fighting against today. I feel ashamed, and I want to apologize. Helen felt a lump form in her throat. That rejection had been particularly painful in her career, but now she saw how every obstacle had contributed to shaping her into the leader she had become. What matters, Dr. Oliveira, is that we're all learning and evolving. And if you'd like, I can help you implement similar changes at your hospital. Their conversation was interrupted by Frank Anderson, who approached with representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services. "Helen," he smiled, "I just received some extraordinary news. St. Clair's program has been selected as a model for a national pilot project on humanization and equity in hospital environments." The news took Helen by surprise. What had started as a local initiative now had the potential to impact hospitals across the country. "But that's not all," Frank continued. "We've been invited to present the program at an international congress in Lisbon next month. Apparently, we're not the only ones facing these challenges, and our approach has caught global attention." Helen felt her eyes well up. She remembered all the times she had swallowed tears of humiliation, all the times she had wanted to give up, all the moments she had doubted herself. Now that pain was transforming into strength to help others. Back at the hotel that night, Helen received dozens of messages from healthcare professionals across the country. They were people who, like her, had suffered from prejudice and discrimination, but now saw a glimmer of hope. St. Clair wasn't just changing as an institution, it was becoming a beacon of transformation for the entire healthcare system. As she organized her notes for the second day of the Congress, Helen found an old photo in her folder, herself 15 years ago, on her first day at St. Clair, shy and insecure. She smiled at the image, wishing she could tell that young nurse that her worth wasn't in her appearance, but in her competence, dedication, and above all, her ability to turn pain into positive change. The Congress would continue for 2 more days, and Helen knew they would be intense days of sharing experiences and building new partnerships. But now she was certain the change that had started in the halls of St. Clair had grown into a much larger movement, and she was ready to lead that transformation, one hospital at a time. Helen's office at St. Clair Hospital had transformed into a true operations center. On the walls, a large map of the United States marked the hospitals that had already begun implementing the humanization and equity program. On her desk, stacks of reports, case studies, and consultation requests piled up next to her laptop, where a video conference with managers from a hospital in Portland was about to begin. "The biggest challenge has been passive resistance," explained Dr. Mauricio, the clinical director of the Oregon hospital, his concerned face filling the screen. "People say they support the changes, but in practice—" "I know exactly what you mean," Helen gently interrupted. "It was one of the first obstacles we faced here too. The question is, how do we turn verbal support into concrete actions?" Their conversation was interrupted by Marina, who hurried into the room. "Helen, sorry to interrupt, but we have a delicate situation in the orthopedics department. A resident physician from the exchange program." Helen gestured an apology to the screen. "Dr. Mauricio, can we continue this in 15 minutes? In the hallway, as they headed to orthopedics, Marina explained the situation. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese resident who had arrived 2 weeks ago through the hospital's international exchange program, was facing difficulties not just with the language, but also with subtle cultural prejudices. "Some doctors have been joking about her accent during clinical meetings," Marina reported, her voice indignant. "And yesterday, during a surgery, one of the surgeons refused to let her assist, claiming he couldn't risk communication issues in a delicate procedure." Helen felt that familiar wave of determination rising in her chest. St. Clair's internationalization program was one of the hospital's new initiatives, part of its commitment to diversity and global excellence. She wouldn't allow prejudices to threaten this progress. They found Dr. Tanaka in the residence lounge, her red eyes betraying recent tears, but her posture still maintaining that characteristic dignity. "Dr. Tanaka," Helen began softly in English, sitting beside her, "I'd like to talk about what's been happening." The young physician hesitated for a moment before speaking. Her account revealed not just the incidents of discrimination, but also her frustration at feeling like she was disappointing expectations. "In Tokyo, I was one of the top residents. At my hospital," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "Here I feel like my knowledge is worthless because my English isn't perfect." At that moment, Dr. Andrew entered the room. As the coordinator of the international residency program, he had been immediately notified of the situation. "This is unacceptable," he declared, his indignation evident. "Dr. Tanaka has an impressive resume and has brought innovative techniques we could learn a lot from. Letting linguistic prejudice prevent this exchange of knowledge is a step backward." Helen agreed, already formulating a plan in her mind. "Dr. Andrew, could you call an emergency meeting with the orthopedics team for this afternoon? And Dr. Tanaka, I'd like you to prepare a presentation on the minimally invasive techniques you developed in Tokyo." "But my English," the resident began, uncertain. "You'll present in English," Helen smiled, "and we'll take the opportunity to announce our new cultural and linguistic competency program." The afternoon was intense. At the meeting with the orthopedics team, Helen didn't need to say much. Dr. Tanaka's brilliant presentation spoke for itself. When she demonstrated, through videos and statistical data, how her techniques had reduced post-operative recovery, time by 40%, even the most resistant doctors began taking notes attentively. "Diversity isn't just a matter of social justice," Helen concluded the meeting. "It's a matter of medical excellence. When we close ourselves off to different perspectives, different forms of knowledge, it's our patients who lose." The next day, during her rescheduled video conference with the Portland Hospital, Helen used Dr. Tanaka's case as an example. "Prejudice has many faces," she explained to Dr. Mauricio. "Sometimes it hides behind technical concerns, sometimes behind institutional traditions. Our job is to expose those faces and show how they prevent us from achieving our true excellence." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Investigating, Helen found a scene that brought tears to her eyes. Dr. Tanaka was performing a procedure, explaining each step in her hesitant English, while the entire orthopedics team watched attentively. Dr. Richard, who now coordinated the humanization program, was simultaneously translating for some international visitors. "See?" Helen smiled at the screen, where Dr. Mauricio watched the scene through his laptop camera. "Change happens like this. One prejudice at a time, one open mind at a time, one transformed life at a time." Back in her office, Helen found an email from the World Health Organization. St. Clair's program had been selected for a global study on best practices in hospital humanization. As she read the email, she couldn't help but smile at how an initiative that had started with a simple nurse-facing prejudice had grown into an international movement. St. Clair was no longer just a hospital. It had become a living laboratory of social transformation, where every challenge was an opportunity to learn, every conflict a chance to grow. And Helen, the nurse many had underestimated, was now recognized as an international leader in hospital humanization. But her greatest pride wasn't the external recognition. It was seeing day after day how small changes turned into great transformations, how smiles replaced looks of disdain, how collaboration replaced competition, how respect replaced prejudice. The road ahead was still long, she knew, but now she wasn't walking it alone. She had a growing community of professionals committed to a more humane and inclusive vision of medicine. And that, more than any award or recognition, was her true reward. It was orientation day for the new residents at St. Clair Hospital. The auditorium was different from what Helen remembered from her own early days, not just because of the diversity of the faces in the seats, but because of the very energy of the environment. Where there had once been tension and fear, there was now anticipation and hope. "Welcome to St. Clair," Helen began, looking at the young professionals before her. "When I first walked into this hospital 15 years ago, I was an insecure nurse who had to prove her worth twice as much as anyone else. Today I'm here to ensure that none of you have to go through that." Among the new residents, she noticed a young doctor wearing a hijab, a man in a wheelchair, a plus-size nurse who reminded her of herself years ago. Each face there represented a victory over prejudices that, not long ago, would have been insurmountable barriers. "The St. Clair you'll know is very different from the one I knew," she continued. "Not just because of the inclusion protocols and policies, but because we've learned that medical excellence and humanity aren't separate concepts. They're interdependent." Dr. Carla, now the residency program director, took the floor. "You were selected not just for your grades or resumes, but for your ability to bring unique perspectives to our institution. Here, your differences aren't tolerated, they're celebrated." The presentation was interrupted by movement at the door. Dr. Richard entered, accompanied by a group of medical students from different universities participating in the hospital immersion program. "Sorry we're late," he smiled, something that would have been unthinkable for the old doctor. "Richard, we were finishing a workshop on unconscious biases in medical practice." Helen watched with satisfaction as the new residents mingled naturally during the coffee break. There were no segregated groups by profession or appearance, as had been common in the past. At one table, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, now a full-fledged surgeon at the hospital, was animatedly conversing in her now fluent English with a diverse group of residents. "Helen," Marina, now the nursing coordinator, called her. "I need to show you something." She led Helen to the hospital's mural where a new section had been installed, transforming the future of healthcare. There, photos and testimonials documented St. Clair's transformation journey, from the early confrontations to the most recent changes. "Last year's residents did this as their capstone project," Marina explained. "They wanted to make sure the story was preserved to inspire future generations." Helen felt her eyes well up as she read some of the testimonials. A nurse shared how she finally felt comfortable wearing her natural hair at work. A doctor recounted how the reverse mentorship program helped him overcome prejudices he didn't even know he had. A patient described how she felt truly welcomed in a hospital environment for the first time. Dr. Helen, a timid voice, interrupted her. It was Gabriella, one of the new nursing residents. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Helen smiled, noticing how the young woman nervously hugged her clipboard. I've always wanted to work at a big hospital, but I always thought people like me wouldn't have a place. Seeing your story for the first time, I feel like I can dream bigger. But how did you deal with the fear at the beginning?" Helen led Gabriella to her office, where an old photo still held a special place on her desk, herself on her first day at St. Clair. "Fear never completely goes away," she replied honestly. "But I learned it can be transformed into strength. Every time someone doubted me, I used that doubt as fuel to prove my worth. And now my job is to ensure the next generation doesn't have to prove anything beyond their competence." The afternoon brought a special surprise. Frank Anderson, still an active member of the board of directors, had organized a panel with healthcare professionals from different hospitals that had implemented programs inspired by St. Clair's model. "What started here," he declared to the packed auditorium, "is no longer just one hospital's program. It's a movement that's redefining what excellence in healthcare means, and you, new residents, are a fundamental part of that transformation. Dr. Andrew, who now headed the cardiology department, presented the impressive results from the past. Year improved quality indicators, reduced staff turnover, increased patient satisfaction. But it was the less obvious numbers that caught the most attention: the increase in diversity among the clinical staff, the reduction in moral harassment complaints, the growth in the number of professionals who felt safe to be themselves at work. At the end of the day, as the new residents said their goodbyes, Helen noticed something different in their eyes. There was no fear, as she remembered feeling on her first day. Instead, there was determination, hope, and above all, the certainty that they were in a place where they could grow while being exactly who they were. Back in her office, Helen found a note left by Gabriella. "Thank you for paving the way so people like me could dream. I promise to do the same for the next generation." Those words perfectly captured what the program had become, not just an institutional policy, but a continuous chain of transformation, passed from one generation to the next. Prejudice and discrimination hadn't completely disappeared, of course, but now there were tools, support, and most importantly, an entire community committed to fighting them. St. Clair Hospital had transformed into more than a center of medical excellence. It was now a cradle of social change, a place where every new professional who walked through its doors had the chance to be part of something greater than themselves. And for Helen, there was no greater reward than seeing in the new residents' eyes the same spark of hope she herself had once dared to have. The morning sun streamed through the windows of St. Clair Hospital, illuminating the hallways in a way that made Helen smile. It was a special day, exactly 1 year since the official nationwide implementation of the humanization program, and 2 years since that fateful morning when Frank Anderson had changed everything by refusing to stay silent. In the face of prejudice, Helen walked through the hospital's hallways, observing the subtle and profound changes that had taken root. On the walls, alongside the traditional notices and schedules, there was now a mural dedicated to transformation stories, accounts from professionals and patients who had experienced the hospital's cultural shift. Helen, Dr. Fields' voice, reached her. The hospital director was accompanied by an international delegation, representatives from the WHO who had traveled to see firsthand the program revolutionizing hospital culture in the United States. "Just the person we were looking for," Dr. Fields smiled. "Our visitors have some questions about how we managed to implement such significant changes in such a short time." Before Helen could respond, they were interrupted by a scene that caught everyone's attention. At the nearby nursing station, Dr. Richard, now an international consultant for the humanization program, was guiding a diverse group of residents. Among them was Gabriella, who a year ago had arrived timid and insecure, now leading a discussion on new patient care protocols. "See," Dr. Richard pointed to a chart, "since we implemented the inclusive care protocol, we've not only improved our satisfaction rates, but also significantly reduced patient hospitalization times." Helen led the international group to her office, now transformed into a small documentation center of the hospital's transformation. On the walls, alongside her diplomas and certifications, were photos that told a story of change. The first, class of residents in the new program, the inauguration of the Inclusive Care Center, the ceremony for the International Hospital Humanization Award. True change, Helen explained to the visitors, didn't happen through decrees or regulations. It happened when we started seeing each person, professional or patient, as a complete human being with their own stories, struggles, and potential. At that moment, Sandra entered the room with surprising news. "Helen, you won't believe it. We just received the results of the National Hospital Environment Survey. St. Clair not only maintained its top position in technical excellence, but now also leads in professional satisfaction and patient care." The international visitors took furious notes as Helen explained how the hospital had balanced technical excellence with humanization. Then Marina burst through the door, her eyes shining with excitement. "Helen, they're here! The new uniforms!" It was another of the program's initiatives, hospital uniforms in truly inclusive sizes, developed with the active participation of staff. A small detail that symbolized a larger change, the recognition that professional dignity starts with the basics, feeling comfortable in your own skin, in your own clothes. The afternoon brought a special surprise. Frank Anderson, now fully recovered and actively involved in social projects, had organized a ceremony to celebrate the program's anniversary. The auditorium was packed. Professionals from St. Clair, representatives from other hospitals, medical and nursing students all gathered to celebrate not just results but a paradigm shift. 2 years ago, Frank began his speech, I witnessed something that made me question everything we considered normal in hospital environments. Today, I see that moment wasn't an end but a beginning. Helen didn't just transform St. Clair. She showed us that it's possible to build a healthcare environment that heals not just bodies, but souls. Dr. Paul, who had initially resisted the changes, now coordinated the mentorship program. He stood up to share his own transformation journey. I learned that true authority doesn't come from fear or intimidation, but from respect and the ability to recognize the value in every person. Dr. Carla, now a respected surgeon, presented impressive data on how diversity in the medical team had improved clinical outcomes. Different perspectives allow us to see problems and solutions that we might have otherwise missed. The most emotional moment, however, came when Helen was called to the stage. In her hands, she held something special, her old hospital ID badge, the one she had carried when she was just a nurse, fighting daily prejudice. This badge, she showed it to the audience, reminds me of where we came from, but more importantly, it reminds me why we keep fighting. Because every new professional who walks through those doors deserves to be judged solely by their competence, not their appearance. At the end of the ceremony, Helen was surprised by an announcement. The humanization program at St. Clair would be expanded to an international network of hospitals. She would be the global coordinator, responsible for bringing the transformation beyond US borders. Returning to her office at the end of that historic day, Helen found a new photo on her wall herself 15 years ago, on her first day at the hospital. Beside it, a recent photo with her diverse and smiling team. The transformation was visible not just in the images, but in the very air that filled the hospital's hallways. St. Clair had become more than a hospital. It was now a symbol that change is possible, that prejudices can be overcome, that excellence and humanity not only can but must walk hand in hand. As she packed up to leave, Helen received one last visitor, a young nursing student who had attended the ceremony. "You know," the young woman said, her eyes shining, "before I heard your story, I thought I'd have to choose between being myself and being a successful professional. Now I know I can be both." Helen smiled, recognizing in that young woman the same dream that had once fueled her own journey. The cycle was complete, but it wasn't ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in the endless story of human transformation. Because in the end, that was the true lesson of St. Clair Hospital. Real change starts with one courageous person willing to stand up and say enough, but it only becomes complete when that courage inspires others to do the same. And so one voice becomes many, one hospital becomes a movement, and one dream becomes reality. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen and the transformation of St. Clair Hospital has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of transformation and humanization, we've prepared a special playlist of equally inspiring stories. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of the human experience. Share your own stories of overcoming and transformation in the comments. Together, we can build a more inclusive and humane world, one hospital at a time.